We are in the fastest and most continuous news cycle in history, and the public's trust in news is at an all-time low. For Tech Republic, I'm Tanya Hall here with Amy Webb, who is a quantitative futurist, the founder of Future Today Institute, a professor at NYU Stern School of Business, and the author of The Signals Are Talking. Welcome, Amy.
Thanks so much, Tanya.
So you recently spoke at an event, an annual event. It's the ONA 17. What is that?
Sure. So the Online News Association has an annual conference. It's the largest gathering anywhere in the world of journalists who work in technology and digital media. And I speak every year about emerging trends that journalists and people within news should be paying attention to. This year was a little different because for the first time, I would argue, we've had this sort of collision of technology, information, and civic issues, and that collision has involved everything from the spread of misinformation to a lot of confusion everywhere around the internet, and in a lot of ways, it's made journalists' jobs both harder but also more important than they've ever been. So, the one of the key issues that I discussed this year was the real significant and I would argue terrifying implications of algorithms that helped to automate news, platforms over which news organizations have very little control, and bad actors all around the world that want to cause widespread confusion for any number of reasons.
Would you say that part of the problem is that we have too many outlets, too many people providing news? I mean, shouldn't we be paying attention to the traditional journalists? But as consumers, we're getting news from all kinds of resources.
Right. So, in the year 2017, anybody with a computer potentially is their own news organization, right? If you think about it, anybody has the ability to put up a website, to use Twitter as essentially a 21st century wire service, and to use Facebook to get out their content. So on the one hand, the answer is the tools of publishing have never been more democratized than they are today. And many people would argue that that's a good thing because we have more perspectives and more viewpoints on what's happening around the world. The challenge is that that's happening at a time when, as I've already mentioned, and as everybody knows, we have people intentionally spreading inaccurate or false information for any number of reasons. But we also have a sort of widespread rejection of, what I would call big J journalism. So people who suddenly mistrust journalists who are trained, and mistrust them because they feel like they're politically motivated or they're not presenting the right information. We've also started to see, widespread rejection of thought leadership and scientific experts, and it's a really interesting moment in history when everybody is a skeptic, but it's difficult to convince anybody of anything, even if there are facts and data that are objective, that are sort of there to back up the claims. So it's a strange moment in time.
What role does speed in getting the news play? I mean, is it because the news is coming at us so fast and from so many different places? I mean, is speed a part of that?
So the role of speed in our digital literacy and our understanding of world events is pretty massive, and there are some economic forces at play over which we have very little control as consumers. So part of the problem is, the first to publish online is the first to rake in the majority of the clicks, and those who have more clicks, will theoretically get paid more. So there's an economic incentive for news organizations to have that first tweet out with the link or the first Facebook post with the link, because what winds up happening is that there's this compounding effect. Everybody else will then retweet, link to that story. But the challenge is that if you're going to be the first, you absolutely have to be correct. And the pressures under journalists now, not only to be fast, but to be accurate at the speed of algorithms and data, is really unprecedented. And it's as a result of everybody's incentive to get their content out first, we're starting to see some sloppiness, and we're seeing a lot of mistakes. One example, during the shooting in Las Vegas, there was a news outlet that posted content pretty early on in the process that was quoting the local police department, which then prompted the local police department to say, actually, we aren't prepared to make that statement. We haven't said any of that information yet, which then caused the news outlet to have to print a retraction. Now, what probably happened was that there was some producer who was in the field who did in fact talk to the police officers, and the story was definitely true. And in their haste to be first, the news outlet went ahead and published before the police department had had an opportunity to make its statement. So did anybody publish anything that was misleading, false, or incorrect? No. But because of that speed, it forced this sort of public admonishment, which then forced a public apology, which had the reverberating effect of making people now think that this news organization isn't trustworthy because it had to print a correction. And that has that goes directly to the speed with which our news is now moving, and that is not good for anybody.
What role does the government play in helping us navigate this path? And I'm not just talking about here in the United States, but globally. What role does the government play in this misinformation?
Sure, like it or not, the government is going to interject itself into how content moves around, and we're already starting to see this take place around the world and in Europe especially. So many people are familiar with Europe's right to be forgotten law, and that is if something gets posted about you online that's incorrect, you don't want it to be there, you have the ability to petition Google and have Google remove that content. Similarly, in other countries, for example, Germany, if there's something incorrect or false about you that's been posted on social media, it is if the social media outlets are alerted to this fact, they must take down whatever that post is within a very short time frame. Otherwise, they can face exorbitant fines. What the offshoot of these local regulations and new government law is that we could very well wind up with a sort of multiverse of internets. So what I have the ability to publish and read in the United States could look completely different from what people in Germany or France or South Africa have access to. And within a pretty short amount of time, because of differing viewpoints on our privacy and our data, and in reaction to all of the fake news incidents that we've seen, we could wind up with what's called a splinter net, or a series of splinter nets, which is the internet behaving differently and using different norms and standards and regulations depending geographically on where you are. And if you spin that out a little bit, things get really interesting. So, on the one hand, if you think misinformation and fake news is a problem now, you literally have not seen, anything yet. Because we could very well wind up with different news stories that have to get published all over the world. But also, if you stop and think about it, doesn't that also open up this sort of crazy can of hacker worms? So, like when I'm online on somebody else's Wi-Fi network, I use some software that allows me to bounce around the internet that makes it more difficult to trace me. But what's interesting is, couldn't there be a series of software tools that get launched to constantly cloak my location so that I have the ability to read news in other places? But that would also give me the opportunity to post news in other places, which then makes the idea of sort of policing the internet really complicated. And it makes you wonder, would Interpol have to have its own deeply embedded cyber forces that combs across the multiverse of splinter nets? I mean, it's nuts if you stop and think about it.
So how, as consumers of the news, can we understand that what we're reading isn't fake news, isn't something that, is wrong? How do we verify as consumers?
Yeah, so the best thing to do is to be skeptical of what you see. but also to take a look at where the information is coming from. Up until very recently, a lot of people were spreading social media content from a website called RT. And in fact, my sister would send me stuff from RT. You know, one day I called her and I said, "Hey, do you know what RT is?" And she's like, "Oh yeah, they're like that one of those crazy cool websites that just like finds funny cat photos and, you know, comes up with really crazy stories. And they're fun to read." And I'm like, "Do you know that the R stands for Russia and the T stands for today, and it's an arm of the Kremlin?" And she was mortified once she found out. So part of the problem is that our sources of information have been reduced to teeny tiny Twitterified, Facebookified, 1 inch by 1 inch, if we're lucky, avatars and logos. And people don't look beyond that to see where the information is really coming from. So step one is to just be skeptical and ask questions. Step two is to check to see where the information is coming from. And if you don't recognize a logo, look it up. And there's an important step three here, and that is, if you have been presented with data, and you know, if the argument is data backed and it's objective information, maybe it butts up against your cherished beliefs. But if it's data driven, if there's quantitative, you know, evidence and analysis, then at some point you have to agree with, maybe you don't agree with, but you have to accept the news as you see it. So this is about just developing smarter digital literacy skills in, you know, beyond the year 2017.
So, how do journalists approach this? You know, this challenge of, you know, they're working really hard, they're doing their due diligence, they're fact checking, they're doing everything, but they're fighting up against all of these other websites and other resources. What do journalists need to do moving forward?
Well, what do journalists need to do moving forward? News organizations moving forward need to figure out a way to have more leverage with the platforms on which they send their content. Because, you know, as of today, Facebook has just started to launch a little sort of teeny tiny gray text line that says whether or not something's a political ad. You're asking an awful lot of people who, again, people are just skimming through their feeds. And that includes journalists, because we're all strapped for time and attention. So news organizations should do a better job collectively of demanding more, you know, of the platforms that they are using. And maybe it's time for them to build their own collective platform to send out content. In terms of individual journalists, you know, it's difficult because there are these economic forces at play, which are quite strong. You know, and there are very real demands at work to be first and to have the best scoops and the best information. But we all have to start taking a longer view. And, you know, there are some real short-term complications with American journalism and the business models that support it. But if we're not thinking about that while we also look at the longer term and start seriously developing completely radically new business models to confront the future before it gets here, then we are going to be in a world of hurt.
Well, I think that's a great insight on what is happening today. And, you know, certainly as consumers, we need to be more aware of what we read and read that little gray fine print if we can on all of the media outlets. Yeah, thank you so much for your time, Amy. And we can find you where?
Well, I'm all over the interwebs, but you can find me at thefuturetodayinstitute.com and amyweb.io.
Thank you so much for your time. And I'm Tanya Hall. You can find me in more interviews like this on Tech Republic.